A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Imagine you are sitting in a window seat on a red-eye flight, crossing the Atlantic or maybe just traversing the dark stretches of the American Midwest. You look out into the void, and there is absolutely nothing but the faint glow of the wingtip light. But just a few thousand feet above you, or perhaps parallel to your flight path, there is a formation of F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters moving at 500 knots. Their transponders are off. Their lights are extinguished. To the civilian air traffic control radar, they are essentially ghosts. Yet you do not collide. There is no mid-air catastrophe. There is a silent, invisible choreography happening in the dark that most people never even consider. It is the ultimate high-stakes game of hide-and-seek, played out in a shared sky that is becoming more crowded by the hour.
It is one of those things where, if the system is working perfectly, you never hear about it. Herman Poppleberry here, by the way. And you are right, Korn. The paradox of the invisible jet is a fascinating engineering and procedural challenge. Our housemate Daniel sent us a prompt this week that really digs into this. He wanted to know how the military avoids hitting Cessnas and Boeings when they are intentionally trying to stay off the grid for operational security. It is not just about stealth technology in the sense of radar-absorbent paint. It is about operational darkness. How do you stay safe when you are hiding? We are talking about the intersection of national security and public safety, and the friction between those two is where things get really interesting.
It is a great question because it touches on the absolute fundamental rule of aviation, which is see and avoid. But if you cannot be seen by electronic means, and you are flying at night so you cannot be seen visually, that rule starts to feel a little thin. I have been looking into the integration of military and civilian air traffic control, and it turns out it is not two separate worlds. It is one deeply integrated, though often segregated, ecosystem. We like to think of the sky as this infinite expanse, the old big sky theory, where two planes are so small they could never possibly hit each other by accident. But with modern traffic density, that theory is dead. We need systems, and those systems have to talk to each other, even when one side is trying to be a ghost.
People often assume the military has its own completely parallel version of the Federal Aviation Administration, but in reality, they have to share the same physical soup of nitrogen and oxygen that we call the sky. The scope of this is massive. We are talking about thousands of military sorties every day in the United States alone. When we talk about dark operations, we are usually talking about the intentional suppression of transponders. In the civilian world, we use Mode 3A, Mode C, and Mode S. These are the pulses that tell a controller who you are, how high you are, and where you are going. When a military pilot flips that switch to off, they are essentially opting out of the primary safety net of modern aviation. They are becoming non-cooperative targets.
So, let's start there. If I am a military pilot and I turn off my transponder, I am not just flying blind, right? There has to be a handoff. Does the military maintain its own form of air traffic control to keep tabs on these guys? Or are they just out there on their own, counting on their own sensors?
They do maintain control, but it is highly situational and layered. Within the United States and most NATO countries, the military uses what are called military radar units, or MRUs. These are specialized control centers, often tucked away on Air Force bases or even mobile units that have a direct data link with the Civilian Air Route Traffic Control Centers, or ARTCCs. If you have ever listened to our episode 812 on the AWACS, you know that the military has its own eyes in the sky. But for domestic training, it is all about the letter of agreement.
A letter of agreement. That sounds very bureaucratic for something involving supersonic fighter jets and stealth technology. It sounds like something you sign when you are renting an apartment, not when you are flying a $100 million weapon system.
It is bureaucratic, but bureaucracy is what keeps planes from trading paint at 30,000 feet. These letters of agreement, or LOAs, are formal contracts between a specific military wing and the local civilian air traffic control center. They carve out specific blocks of airspace, which we call special use airspace or restricted areas. When the military wants to go dark, they do it inside these bubbles. The civilian controllers know that from 10,000 to 25,000 feet, in a specific polygon over Nevada or the Carolinas, for instance, there is military activity. They just route the civilian traffic around that bubble. It is like a temporary wall in the sky.
Okay, so that handles the training ranges. But what about transit? These jets do not just teleport from the factory to the restricted range. They have to fly through civilian corridors to get there. They have to cross over cities and follow the same highways in the sky that a Delta flight uses. How do they handle the dark requirement when they are moving between point A and point B?
That is where it gets more complex. Generally, for transit, military aircraft are required to follow standard civilian procedures. They squawk a code, they talk to the center, and they stay visible. However, if there is a specific operational reason to be dark during transit, maybe they are testing a new sensor or doing a low observable ferry flight, they use a concept called MARSA. That stands for Military Assumes Responsibility for Separation of Aircraft.
Wait, so the military just says, "We got this," and the civilian controller just lets them go? That sounds like a lot of trust to put in a pilot who is intentionally making themselves hard to see.
Essentially, yes, but it is not a free-for-all. MARSA is usually invoked when multiple military aircraft are flying in a formation. The lead aircraft might have its transponder on so the civilian controller can see the whole group as one single point of data, while the other 5 or 10 jets in the formation stay dark. The military lead pilot is then legally and operationally responsible for making sure his wingmen do not hit anyone else. It shifts the liability and the workload from the civilian controller to the military flight lead. It is a massive responsibility. If there is a collision under MARSA, it is entirely on the military's head.
That makes sense for a formation, but what about a single jet that needs to test its low observable characteristics against real-world sensors? I am thinking about how congested the skies are today. If you look at the flight paths over the East Coast or even over Europe, there is almost no empty space. How do they ensure that a dart jet does not stumble into the path of a commercial airliner that is just following its GPS track?
You are touching on procedural deconfliction. This is why we have things like NOTAMs, which we covered way back in episode 693. A notice to air missions will be issued to warn civilian pilots that a certain area is active with high-speed military maneuvers. But beyond that, the military actually uses a much more advanced version of the transponder system that the public never sees. It is called IFF, or Identification Friend or Foe.
Right. We talked about the digital handshake in episode 1002, but I thought IFF was strictly for combat, to keep from shooting down your own guys during a dogfight or a missile engagement.
It is, but it has a secondary function for safety. The current standard is Mode 5. While Mode S is what your Southwest flight uses to talk to the ground, Mode 5 is a cryptographically secure, high-power system that allows military radar to see dark aircraft with incredible precision. It uses lethal interrogation techniques, not lethal as in killing, but lethal as in highly persistent and accurate. So, even if the civilian controller at a regional center sees a blank spot on his screen, a military controller sitting at a terminal 3 rooms over, or an AWACS circling 100 miles away, sees every single military tail number in high definition.
So, it is not that they are invisible to everyone. They are just invisible to the people who do not have the encryption keys. It is like a private, encrypted network versus the public internet. The civilian controller is looking at the public web, while the military controller is on the dark web, so to speak, seeing everything.
That is a perfect analogy. The military maintains a God's eye view of the entire battle space or training area using these encrypted links. The deconfliction happens because the military controller is often literally sitting next to, or at least on a direct line with, the civilian controller. If they see a civilian aircraft drifting toward a dark military operation, the military controller will immediately vector their pilots away. The burden of avoiding the collision is almost entirely on the military side because they are the ones with the full picture. They are the ones with the active radar and the high-speed data links.
I wonder about the communication side of that. Does the military pilot have a radio tuned to the civilian frequencies while they are doing this, or are they strictly on their own encrypted channels? It seems like they would need to hear if a civilian pilot is declaring an emergency nearby.
They are almost always monitoring both. Military aircraft have multiple radios. They will have their tactical frequencies, which might use have-quick frequency hopping technology to prevent jamming or eavesdropping. Have-quick is fascinating because it synchronizes the radio to a precise time of day and a specific hopping pattern, making it nearly impossible for an outsider to follow the conversation. But they are also required to monitor GUARD, which is the International Emergency Frequency at 121.5 MHz for VHF or 243 MHz for UHF. Most military pilots also stay in contact with a civilian controller during transit using standard VHF frequencies. It is only when they enter that special use airspace that they might switch over to a purely military tactical frequency.
It seems like a lot of the safety depends on the pilot's situational awareness. We often talk about how advanced these new cockpits are. An F-35 pilot has a helmet that basically lets them see through the floor of the plane. Does that technology play into this? If they are flying dark, are they using their own onboard sensors like AES or radar, or infrared search and track to make sure they are not about to clobber a Cessna?
That is the see and avoid part of the equation, but upgraded for the 21st century. A modern fighter's AESA radar, that is active electronically scanned array, is powerful enough to pick up a small bird at dozens of miles, let alone a metal airplane. They use their sensors to maintain a bubble of awareness around them. But here is the thing, Korn. Relying on the jet's radar is actually a bit of a risk in a stealth scenario because turning on a powerful radar is like shining a flashlight in a dark room. It gives away your position to anyone with a radar warning receiver.
Right, so if you are trying to be truly dark, you can't use your radar either. You are relying on passive sensors or off-board data. You are trying to be a black hole in the sky, not a lighthouse.
This is where the data link becomes critical. The jet receives a picture of the sky from the AWACS or from ground-based sensors via Link 16 or the newer Multifunction Advanced Data Link or MADL. This allows the pilot to see all the civilian traffic around them without having to emit a single photon of radar energy themselves. It is a very high-stakes game of chess where the military pilot knows where everyone is, but no one knows where they are.
I want to go back to the idea of the civilian controller for a second. If I am an air traffic controller in a busy sector like New York or London, and I have a military jet that needs to go dark, what does that look like on my screen? Do I just see a target disappear? Or is there a specific protocol for the handoff so I don't have a heart attack thinking a plane just went down?
There is a very specific protocol. The pilot will inform the controller that they are venturing into a tactical portion of their flight. The controller will then issue a clearance that essentially says, radar services terminated, frequency change approved. At that point, the controller is no longer responsible for that aircraft separation. In the United States, this often happens when the jet enters a MOA, or military operations area. On the radar screen, the tag for that aircraft might remain, but it will be marked as non-radar or projected based on its last known heading and speed. Or, more likely, the controller just clears a huge path around that entire MOA, so they do not have to worry about what is happening inside it.
That feels like a very inefficient use of airspace. We are always hearing about how the skies are overcrowded and flights are delayed. If we are carving out massive chunks of the sky for a few jets to play hide and seek, that has to have an impact on the commercial sector. Is there a push to make this more efficient?
It definitely does have an impact. And this is a major point of contention. In Europe, for example, the airspace is so tight that they use something called flexible use of airspace. Instead of having a permanent military bubble that is always off limits, the military has to book the airspace for specific time slots. If they are not using it, it is immediately released back to civilian traffic. This requires a level of real-time coordination that is incredibly complex. In the US, we have more room, so we can afford to have these permanent restricted areas, but even those are being scrutinized as civilian traffic grows. The FAA and the Department of Defense are constantly negotiating over these blocks of sky.
I am curious about the edge cases. What happens when something goes wrong? If a military jet is flying dark, no transponder, tactical frequency only, and they have a massive engine failure or a bird strike, there's suddenly an emergency in a sky full of people who cannot see them. What is the protocol for flipping the switch from dark to visible? How fast can they reappear?
The first thing a pilot does in an emergency, after the immediate fly the airplane steps, is to make the aircraft visible. They will immediately squawk 7700 on their transponder. Even if they were in a dark mode, that emergency code is designed to override a lot of settings and scream for attention on every radar screen in the vicinity. They will also switch their radio to the civilian guard frequency and declare a mayday. The transition happens in seconds. The moment safety of flight is at risk, operational security goes out the window.
But if they have a total electrical failure, they cannot squawk. They are just a silent, dark piece of metal falling through the sky.
Then we are back to the oldest methods in the book. They use their lights. Even a stealth jet has high-intensity strobe lights and navigation lights for safety. If the electrics are gone but the pilot has a battery, they are flipping every light they have on to be as visible as possible. But this is exactly why the MARSA and the LOA systems exist. The military does not just fly dark in the middle of a civilian airway for the fun of it. They do it in areas where, if they have an emergency, they are most likely to only be a danger to themselves or their wingmen. They try to ensure that the footprint of their risk is contained within that special use airspace.
You mentioned Israel earlier. It is such a unique case because the country is so small. You can cross the entire country in a fighter jet in just a few minutes. How do they manage this when the military is essentially always on high alert, and the civilian airport, Ben Gurion, is right in the middle of everything?
It is one of the most coordinated airspaces in the world. The Israeli Air Force and the civilian authorities basically operate out of the same data set. There is no such thing as a hidden military jet in Israeli domestic airspace as far as the controllers are concerned. They have to be that tight because the margin for error is zero. If a jet goes dark there, it is usually because they are crossing the border into hostile territory, and at that point, civilian deconfliction is the least of their worries. But domestically, it is all about total transparency between the two branches. They use a unified radar picture that integrates both civilian and military feeds.
So, looking at the broader picture, the deconfliction is a mix of three things: geography, which is the restricted airspace; technology, which is the encrypted IFF and data links; and procedure, which is the MARSA and the letters of agreement. It is a layered approach. It is like that Swiss cheese model of safety we always talk about.
Precisely. The Swiss cheese model, developed by James Reason, suggests that in any complex system there are multiple layers of defense. Each layer has holes, like a slice of Swiss cheese. An accident only happens when the holes in every single layer line up perfectly. In this case, the layers are the NOTAMs, the MRU controllers, the pilot's own sensors, the Mode 5 IFF, and the physical separation of the airspace. No single layer is perfect. The NOTAMs might be missed by a general aviation pilot. The IFF might have a glitch. The pilot might lose situational awareness. But when you stack them all together, the holes do not line up.
One thing most people do not realize is that the military actually spends a huge amount of time practicing civilian deconfliction. It is a core part of their training. You cannot be a flight lead in the Air Force or the Navy if you do not understand how to manage a formation through civilian corridors. It is not just about being a great stick-and-rudder pilot. It is about being a manager of complex systems.
Oh, absolutely. The military takes airspace violations incredibly seriously. If an F-16 pilot accidentally drifts into the path of an Airbus, the paperwork alone would be enough to ground them for months. There is a huge amount of professional pride, but also a huge amount of fear of the consequences. This is why they rely so heavily on the military radar units. These MRU controllers are the unsung heroes of this whole thing. They are the ones who have to talk to the civilian center on one radio and the dark fighter pilots on the other, acting as the bridge between those two worlds. They are essentially translators, turning tactical maneuvers into civilian-friendly traffic reports.
Does this change with the rise of unmanned systems? We are seeing more and more military drones, like the Global Hawk or the newer Loyal Wingman concepts. These things are often flying dark for long periods. Is it harder to deconflict when there is not a pilot in the cockpit to see and avoid? I mean, a computer doesn't have a neck to turn.
It is much harder. This is actually the biggest hurdle for integrating drones into the national airspace. A drone does not have a human neck to turn and look out the window. So, for drones, the military has to be even more careful. They often use chase planes, which are manned aircraft that follow the drone just to act as its eyes during transit through civilian areas. Or they have to use incredibly advanced ground-based sense and avoid radar systems.
That seems like it defeats the purpose of an autonomous system if you have to fly a manned jet behind it, just to make sure it does not hit a Cessna. It is like having a self-driving car, but requiring a guy on a motorcycle to ride next to it.
It is a temporary solution. The long-term goal is to have those drones equipped with their own certified sense and avoid technology that is even better than a human pilot. We are talking about 360-degree infrared and radar coverage that can identify and track every object in the sky and autonomously maneuver to stay clear. But until that is fully certified, the military is being very conservative. They mostly keep the big drones in very high altitude blocks, way above where most civilian traffic flies.
So, if you're at 60,000 feet in a global hawk, you're basically in your own world anyway. There are no Cessnas at 60,000 feet.
Most commercial traffic is capped at around 41,000 feet. Above that, it is mostly military and the occasional high-end business jet. That vertical separation is the simplest and most effective form of deconfliction. It is the ultimate layer of Swiss cheese.
Let's talk about the international aspect. If a US carrier strike group is operating in the Mediterranean or the South China Sea, they are in international airspace. There is no FAA there. There are no domestic restricted areas. How do they handle deconfliction when they have dozens of dark jets flying around in an area that might also be a major shipping and transit lane for civilian airliners?
That is where the concept of due regard comes in. Under international law, specifically the Chicago Convention, state-owned aircraft, which includes the military, are not technically bound by the civilian rules of the air when operating over the high seas. However, they are required to operate with due regard for the safety of all other aircraft. It is a legal obligation that the US and NATO take very seriously.
Due regard. That sounds like a very subjective term. It sounds like something you say when you want to do whatever you want, but sound polite about it.
It is, but the US military has a very specific definition for it. Operating under due regard means the military aircraft must meet one of four conditions. They have to be tracked by their own radar, or they have to be in visual range of their own controller, or they have to have their own onboard radar that can detect other traffic, or they have to be operating in an area where they know there is no other traffic. In practice, this means the carrier's E-2 Hawkeye, which is their version of the AWACS, is acting as the air traffic controller for the entire region. They see the civilian airliners on their radar, and they make sure their dark fighters stay far away from them.
So even in the middle of the ocean, there is a controller. It is just that the controller is on a ship or in a turboprop plane circling at 20,000 feet. The military never truly flies blind. They are always under someone's watch.
The only time they would be truly dark, meaning no one knows where they are, would be in a high-intensity conflict where they are penetrating deep into enemy territory. In that case, there are no civilian planes anyway because the NOTAMs would have cleared the entire region of non-combatants. But in peacetime, the military is always being watched by someone, even if that someone is another military asset.
It is interesting how much the civilian world relies on the military's competence. We just assume that when we fly, the military knows where we are and will get out of our way. And for the most part, that is true. They have the better sensors, the better maneuverability, and the ultimate responsibility. It is a silent service.
It is a service they provide that goes unnoticed. And it is not just about avoiding collisions. The military often provides assistance to civilian aircraft in distress. There are many stories of military pilots intercepting a civilian plane that has lost its radio or is having trouble with its landing gear, using their eyes and their sensors to help the civilian pilot figure out what is wrong. They become a guardian angel in those scenarios.
I remember an episode we did, I think it was number 69, about aviation diplomacy in hostile skies. We talked about how these invisible walls are created. This is the operational version of that. It is not just a diplomatic wall. It is a technical and procedural wall that keeps these two very different types of aviation from harming each other.
And it is getting more digital every day. We are moving toward a system called ADS-B, which is Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. This is the new standard where planes constantly broadcast their GPS position. The military is integrating with this too, but with a twist. They have a mode that allows them to broadcast their position to civilian ATC, but the data is filtered so that the general public using apps like FlightAware or ADS-B Exchange cannot see them.
Ah, so they are visible to the professionals, but invisible to the hobbyists. They are squawking for the tower, but not for the internet.
It is about balancing safety with operational security. They don't want a foreign intelligence service or even just a curious person with a $20 radio dongle to be able to track the movement of every stealth fighter. But they do want the controller at Atlanta Hartsfield to know they are there. This selective visibility is the future of military aviation in shared airspace. It is a more nuanced version of dark.
It feels like we are moving toward a world where the concept of dark is becoming more and more nuanced. It is not just an on-off switch. It is a spectrum of visibility depending on who is asking and what they need to know. It is about identity management in the sky.
That is exactly right. And as AI starts to take over air traffic control, which is something we should probably do a whole episode on soon, this will become even more automated. You could have an AI controller that manages both military and civilian traffic, knowing the exact position of every dark jet, but only revealing that information to the civilian pilots when it is necessary for a course correction. The AI would be the ultimate keeper of secrets.
It is a far cry from the old days of just flying into a cloud and hoping for the best. I can't imagine what it was like in the 50s, when the technology was so primitive.
Oh, the stories from the 1950s and 60s are terrifying. Back then, the coordination was almost non-existent. There were a lot of close calls and quite a few mid-air collisions because the technology just wasn't there to bridge the gap. We have come a long way. The level of safety we have today is a miracle of engineering and cooperation.
So, for the practical takeaways for our listeners, if you are a pilot, or even just a frequent flyer, what should you know about this? First, I think it is understanding that special use airspace is there for a reason. If you see a restricted area on a sectional chart, it is not just a suggestion, it is a high-speed, high-stakes environment where people are intentionally not looking for you in the traditional way. They are focused on their mission, and they are counting on you to stay out of their bubble.
And for the passengers, just have a little more faith in the system. The skies are more monitored than you can possibly imagine. Even when it looks like empty space, there is a massive infrastructure of radar, satellites, and data links ensuring that the invisible jets stay that way. The military and civilian sectors are in a constant silent dialogue to keep you safe.
Also, if you are interested in tracking this stuff yourself, you can actually look up NOTAMs. There are public databases where you can see where the military is carving out airspace for the day. It is a great way to see the sheer scale of military operations. You can see the polygons of restricted airspace popping up all over the map.
Yeah, check out our website at myweirdprompts.com, and you can find links to some of those resources in the show notes for episode 693. It is really eye-opening to see how much of the sky is actually being used for these tactical dances. You realize that the sky is not just empty space, it is a highly managed resource.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. I think it is easy to take for granted how much coordination it takes just to keep the lights on and the planes in the air. The fact that the military can operate with such high levels of secrecy while still being a responsible neighbor in the sky is a testament to some pretty incredible engineering and discipline. It is a reminder that even when things seem chaotic, there is often a very structured system underneath it all.
It really is. And it is a reminder that even in our modern, transparent world, there is still a place for the dark, as long as you have the right handshake to navigate it. The invisible dance continues every single night, thousands of times over.
Well said. And hey, if you've been enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a quick review on your podcast app or on Spotify. We are coming up on our 1000th episode soon, which is just wild to think about, and those reviews really help new people find the show. We want to keep growing this community of curious minds.
Yeah, it genuinely makes a difference. We love seeing the community grow and hearing your feedback. If you want to get in touch or send us a prompt like Daniel did, you can find the contact form at myweirdprompts.com. We read everything that comes in, and we love the challenges you throw at us.
We've got some great topics lined up for the next few weeks, including a look at the future of AI in the cockpit and some deep dives into historical aviation mysteries. So make sure you are subscribed. Thanks for hanging out with us in the Poppleberry House today.
Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies, even if you can't see everything that's up there. There is more going on than meets the eye.
This has been my weird prompts. I am Corn Poppleberry.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. We will see you in the next one.
Take care, everyone. Stay safe up there.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my